happy to be here. I just arrived in Bordeaux 1 hour ago for the first time. It's really, really nice to be here and to see some familiar faces here as well. I'm going to talk about this book, which I apologize to anybody who's heard me talking about it before, because you won't hear much new today. But how I tend to talk about this book, which came out last year, is that I kind of feel the need to explain where it came from and why I wrote it, and talk a little bit about the journey or the process of writing the book in a way, because it's a book that came together over some 10 years or something, really. I mean, I didn't spend 10 years writing it, but the idea for it came, in a sense, shortly after I finished my PhD, which was around 2012, 2013. And then I put it aside for a bit before starting to work on it, actually really intensively. Mostly I wrote it during the pandemic. But it builds on a number of published articles elsewhere, and in some senses tries to thread together things which I had written elsewhere. There's a lot of new material as well, but I feel like now this is the purpose of a book, for me anyway. In the UK academic system, we are really pushed to be writing journal articles in high impact journals, above all, in many of the social sciences. Not all, actually. Political sciences is a little different, but I come from an interdisciplinary background. I'm a sort of mongrel with no disciplinary home, having studied politics and sociology as an undergraduate, then international development. I'm now in a kind of urban studies interdisciplinary department. And so, yeah, we're supposed to write papers, and to publish a book is a real labor of love. People don't give you much time or credit for it. You have to push, you have to work hard, you have to really be motivated. And for me, it was wanting to tell a bigger story than I could tell in an article, and to thread together some of the things I've been thinking about across many years. So I'm going to begin. This is a photo of Addis Ababa, the outskirts. For anyone who knows that city, there's been this enormous publicly funded housing program, which has been very controversial, in some ways successful, in some ways not successful. And I'll speak about it a little bit. But it represented, in one way, the extent of the changes happening in this part of Africa in the cities. Now, there are big changes happening all over Africa in the cities. The urbanization rates, as I'm sure many of you know, are quite high across the continent. But I had a particular interest in Eastern Africa and thinking about the different kinds of urbanisms emerging within Eastern Africa. And I'll say a bit more about why. So this is a map of population density. It doesn't come through that clearly. It was actually done by a colleague of mine who used to be at the University of Sheffield, who's one of these GIS map whiz people. And so this shows you in kind of spikes with shadows the density of populations in different parts of Africa. And I find this really interesting because it shows that the real clustering of population on the African continent is kind of in three main areas. One is Western Africa, the kind of central Western Africa. Then there is the Great Lakes region around Lake Victoria, Lake Albert, and so on, Uganda, Rwanda, Congo, parts of Tanzania, Eastern Congo, and then the Ethiopian highlands. So two of those regions with real dense population are in Eastern Africa, but these are also countries that have very low levels of urbanization. So if you look at Burundi, Rwanda, DRC, Uganda, the level of the population that is considered urbanized, and we can get into all the problems of measuring this, but in any of the conventional measures, is very low. So the density of the population is high, but mostly rural. And I think this reflects something interesting about what's going on in these countries and how actually this transformation is happening extremely fast, against a really complex backdrop of very high population densities, but changing now from a more agricultural societies, of course, to more urbanized ones. So I'm just going to show a couple of things to give a kind of big picture of thinking about the region. Now, this is not very accurate, this map. Please don't focus on the details. It's one of many maps you might find based on United Nations data, which is very flawed, but it shows the levels of urbanization in different countries around the world. And with the red, those countries in red being the lowest proportions of people living in cities. And you can see there that Eastern Africa has the highest number of countries, really the highest concentration of less urban countries of anywhere in the world. So that in itself is quite interesting. But also, if you look at the pace of change, again, setting aside some of the problems with the statistics, this graph just shows, using the same kinds of data, the pace at which the population is becoming urbanized. So the change from rural to urban as a proportion of the population. And there, that thick black line is Eastern Africa. And so you can see that even compared to Western Africa, South Asia, China even, and Eastern Asia, the rate of urbanization is consistently, not consistently, sorry, but on average, higher than anywhere else in the world. And so you can see that spike for China, that's Eastern Asia, where there was a very rapid spike there. So this is a region where we see these countries where sometimes 20%, 25% of the population only are living in cities, but it's changing extremely fast. And so on that basis, I talk about the region itself as a kind of frontier of urbanization. So and I'll talk about this word frontier a little bit, because now there is a lot of literature that talks about urban frontiers. It's kind of been very popular, particularly in the Anglophone literature in recent years. But a lot of the time, what they're talking about is a more local or micro level processes of land use change or of capitalist development converting on the rural periphery of the cities, converting those to urban uses. Whereas I'm actually talking about globally, a part of the world that is experiencing this transition to urban later than other regions, but also extremely fast. And I talk about it as being also a kind of peripheral frontier, because this is a region that has not been at the forefront of debates in urban studies. People tend to think of these countries as primarily rural, agricultural, savannas and deserts. And only very recently have people started to look at the cities, certainly quite a lot in the last 5 years or so. But it's somewhere that has not, it's kind of at the frontier of urban change, but at the same time, it's not been central to those conversations. Now, East Africa is also somewhere which, and this is the first time I'm speaking sort of explicitly to a Francophone audience, which is interesting because there's so much we miss in the Anglophone literature, and there is so much that we assume, and of course we come with our own heavy colonial baggage. So there's a lot of British colonies in this region of Africa. And it was very central in the British colonial imagination. But there's also something, there are other things going on, which is, in some ways, it's branding itself as a region in a particular way. This has happened in the sphere of real estate development, for example, and in terms of trade and investment. And it plays this quite central role in the Chinese Belt and Road strategy as the entry point to Africa, because of course it's on that side. So you can see that as a region, it has, even though you can debate where the boundaries are, there's something about it regionally, which I found interesting. And I wanted to look not just at the country, the city, and Africa writ large, but also to understand, if we take into account things happening at regional level, what does that mean? So with that, just a few comments about the region. I want to now plunge into going back to my kind of first engagements with countries in this region as a very naive PhD researcher in about 2009, when I first went to Kampala. I was at the London School of Economics, and there was a research center working on questions of political crisis, civil war, reconstruction. And one stream of that was looking at cities. And my supervisor was involved, Joe Beale. And so I ended up going to Uganda and Rwanda thinking, I thought there was something interesting comparative to look at just on some literature I'd read, and I'd never been to those countries. And when I arrived in Kampala, I was overwhelmed and excited and certainly intellectually stimulated by thinking about the nature of extreme, economic informality, if you want to put it that way, extreme population growth, seemingly very dysfunctional institutions, all of these characteristics quite often stereotypically associated with a fast-growing city in the global south, which I was trying to understand. But what really then threw them into relief was going over to Rwanda, over the border, which, again, quite a lot has now been written about Kigali, but there you saw a real drive with very real implications, for better or worse, to plan the city through a master planning process, to change the nature of land tenure, to bring in very specific kinds of investment and create a very certain kind of built environment and landscape. This is a slide that I've used too many times, and it shows an informal settlement in the city center, which was controversially completely razed in 2007 in order to make way for this planned central business district. And this got a lot of attention, as you can imagine, particularly including from people like Vanessa Watson writing about fantasy cities, because this was a big fanfare. Now, of course, it didn't materialize that way for some time, and it still hasn't. And all during my PhD research from 2009, 10, 11, on subsequent visits in 2013, 15, it was more or less like this, with some roads and infrastructure put in. But really, a lot of people had been cleared and swept away. And this was happening all over the city without apparently rapid new developments taking their place. And this was something that was unimaginable in the context of Kampala, right? The idea that you could just remove huge numbers of people in the interest of some kind of plan that was on paper. This is another image from the master plan, which was designed partly by American, partly by Singaporean planners and designers. And even at the time, you had, this was an advisor working with the city who was actually from elsewhere in Africa and was working for UN Habitat. And people were saying quite openly, non-Rwandan people were saying quite openly in private, that this was something that wasn't real. It didn't represent the real city. It wasn't appropriate, and they were trying to find ways to work around it. But that doesn't mean it didn't have very real consequences, which we'll come to. One of which, of course, was the mass displacement of people. And on engaging with traders, small traders, market traders, street vendors, which I did in both cities, and talking to the people in the city government whose role it was to manage or rearrange trade, was very striking in Kigali. This is what someone said to me who worked in the city administration, saying, we need these people to understand that we don't want them in the city. The government doesn't need you. And this was really striking to me, because the idea that you didn't need them seemed to contrast again with Kampala, where these people seem to be politically extremely important, right? So politicians did need the market traders and vendors. They were central to their political base, central to the legitimacy of a lot of political actors. So you had a very different situation in terms of how these groups of people were valued, and whether they could simply be swept away in the interests of some urban development vision. And here again in Kampala, the way in which the economy plays out on the street, which was in the process of being really crushed in Kigali, with these small exceptions, right, of people trying to sell things at night in bus stations, running away from the police, moving their market from place to place, which I'm sure we've all seen in some places where that level of enforcement in Kigali was consistent and strict. And again here, this was a couple of years later. Actually, this was in 2009. This was something like 3,000 households moved from a hill for a housing project that ended up being a very high-end housing project with supposedly for middle income, but in the end, we're talking about units of $500,000 and $500,000 and right down to maybe $200,000, but not remotely affordable to the majority of the population. So this is what was going on. And when I was in Kampala, because I moved between the two cities, obviously they were in neighboring countries, I was able to move quite a few times during my fieldwork. In the Kampala City Council, these are just some pictures I took on the left, because the building was so run down, the sense that this was not a valued government department, that the City Council was something that was old, it was underinvested. And this goes back to a story from the 1980s of basically disinvestment in urban planning and urban governance in the whole kind of part of the new public management neoliberal model. That's changed now. But at that time, there was a sense that the city government was ignored, didn't matter. And some of the officials working there kept using this term, the low bargaining side, saying, we are trying to rearrange the market traders, or we are trying to change the way transport works in the city, but we're on the low bargaining side, meaning that they had very little power relative to traders themselves and relative to higher level politicians to actually do anything. And whenever they made an attempt, somebody would intervene. And so just thinking about the government as a city as bargaining in that way and using that language was very interesting to me, particularly given that if you go over to Kigali, it's clearly the traders themselves, the transport workers themselves who are on the low bargaining side, right? Not the city officials. And again, this came at a time where there was this huge discourse in the media in Kampala around the chaos of the city. So this was also quite politically driven because the central government and city government were from opposing parties. And the idea that Kampala was chaos that couldn't be managed was actually part of a long-term project in a way to take control of the city by the central government. But nevertheless, all this seemed to simply create more challenges of governance within the city. So I had the comparison between these two cities in my mind when I went there, and it was the basis of my PhD. But then a few years later, after the PhD and after publishing some articles, I went to Addis Ababa for the first time in 2014 to do some research on property development and the land tenure system in the city and property taxation, because it came through an interest in property tax and what that can tell you about the politics of the place, about who has power, about who is able to extract value from land and property. And what I saw there was really just, I wasn't prepared, for the kind of scale of physical transformation, of construction, of all kinds, taking over seemingly every part of the city, in a way that, again, was very different from what I've seen in Kampala or Kigali. So in Kampala, in all these places, you had investment, you had a boom of some kind. But it was much more incremental and piecemeal. And in the case of Rwanda, actually, there was more clearing of space than building on space overall. So Addis, we saw something very different, but also very specific things like the mass housing program. Hundreds of thousands of units, over 300,000 units constructed. Not so many at the time I did my research there, but certainly already hundreds of thousands. And this, grand light railway, which was the first of its kind in Africa, and so on. Now these I've done separate research on, and there are many ways to kind of critique them and learn from them. But there was nothing like that kind of public infrastructure or housing investment happening in the other two cities. And they weren't, Ethiopia is not a rich country. It's a bigger country, but per capita it was no wealthier. It had a similar background in a revolutionary struggle, a kind of militarized regime. There were many similarities in terms of an ethnically fragmented population. So I was really intrigued at what drives one kind of government to take a city and think we're going to invest in mass housing and mass transport in this way, and what enables them to implement it. So I started to think about a three-way comparison, which is what happens within the book. And the kind of main currents within urban studies and urban theory, certainly that we get exposed to a lot in the Anglophone world, right? And so again, this is a caveat, but around advances in thinking about cities and urban theory, in a way, these are three of the most prominent trends, and none of them helped me to answer my question and trying to explain these very different forms of urbanization, these very different types of investment, very different capacities to transform the city and so on. On the one hand, you have all the debates around planetary urbanization, which is very interesting in thinking about how the urban extends beyond the city, in thinking about what that means for transformation, including in places like Eastern Africa, but it doesn't tell you much about the distinction between three very different cities, very different kind of urban regimes. Similarly, the huge literature on urban neoliberalism and its regulatory dynamics that comes out of, Neil Brenner, out of all the Marxist urbanist literature, Jamie Peck, and so on, that has been so influential. It tells you a little bit how neoliberalism can land in a different regulatory space and then come out a bit different the other side. But it almost suggests that every difference we want to understand within a city is a result of a different regulatory filtering of neoliberalism, without perhaps recognizing that sometimes there are things other than neoliberalism going on, as well as neoliberalism, or different than that. And it's not just the regulatory environment that's different, it's the politics, it's the decisions people are making, it's the dynamics of power. So again, I find that kind of inadequate to explain. And then, of course, all the literature that has come out of cities of the South, which has generated new ways of thinking about the epistemology of the urban and so on. Also very rich and stimulating, but has tended, at least initially, the list is changing, to somewhat homogenize the idea of the urban South, in the idea of the Southern urbanism, the idea of what can we learn about the South that is telling us different things about cities, not about differences within the South, often within very close regions. So for me, the thing missing in all of these is something about politics, something about the nature of politics, which we might think about at the national level, but potentially also at different scales. And this kind of, politics is defined in so many different ways and in so many different disciplines. That this is something obviously I wanted to think about when writing the book, because I was pretty certain that the main story that would help me answer my questions was a political one, but then what do I mean by that? And actually a lot of the literature, if you look at the literature that's come out of a lot of anthropological and sociological studies of popular politics in recent times, it makes a distinction, to take the typical Rancièrean kind of distinction between the political as something that happens away from the state in spaces that are somewhat removed or even autonomous from elite politics or from governance or from the police order. And I don't know how helpful that is. I didn't find that so helpful in thinking about the politics of these places where the elite and popular politics are very closely imbricated, and the state is also within all of those political struggles. I say that not as an expert on all that literature, but as all the secondary literature, a lot of it about the global north, seemed to me to have limited purchase. And at the same time, I wanted to think about scale, because even though this is a big debate in geography, and I'm not really a geographer either, some of the geographers now say, scale is dead. There's no such thing. But for me, it was, again, if we just look at the national and the city, we're missing something. We're missing something about the way capital is circulating within that region and the way ideas are circulating within that region and the way the politics of the government in that region is webbed together historically and so on. So I wanted to do something that was neither, some people have talked about methodological cityism, some of this urban studies literature that treats the city as almost separate from everything else and neglects the national picture. And then, of course, you have a political economy literature that only thinks about the national scale, to avoid those things, but also to go beyond these ideas that tend to come out of the more materialist turn, drawing on actor network theory and assemblage theory, which tend to see, if they talk about causality at all, they tend to see it as assembled locally in particular places. So like, for example, Amin and Thrift in their book, Seeing Like a City, they talk about this idea of urban forces that are constructed within the city that shape the way things are. But if you want to actually look at the causes of things, you may need to look beyond the urban. You may need to look beyond that scale and have a different epistemological approach to what you understand to be a causal force. So anyway, this draws, I'm drawing here on critical realism as a kind of approach to understanding the way different causal factors work together and how you can think about them as being laminated at different scales, to use that literature from critical realism. So in the book, I have, and this is in a way a result of a practice of kind of 10, 15 years of thinking about these cities, writing different papers and sort of distilling what I saw to be the most important causal factors. And again, I make this point on the last slide about causality. This is quite controversial to some people. And it was, when I presented this at the LSE, there were some people who were like, why? It's very bold of you to be talking about causality, or the idea that you wanted to explain something, like the causes of something, or the causes of difference, because that is not what has been at the forefront of urban studies anyway, right? A lot of it has been thick description, enriching our, ontological questions. What is the urban? How do we understand what it is? How do we better describe? Which is valuable, right? But it's very different from looking at questions of causality. And so my book is kind of more in the latter tradition. And so there's these 4 factors, causal factors that I identify in the book, which attempt to distill a lot of complex things. And of course, this is my interpretation of how to think about these causal factors. The first of which, and this draws on, to some extent, on the political settlements framework, emerging particularly from people like Mushtaq Khan at SOAS in London. I've been a bit involved with that framework, but not too much, because there's a whole bunch of people who do this work on political settlements, and it's mostly quite national in focus. But what it does in some ways is to focus on the distribution of power between groups, and just this quite simple point of taking social groups and entities seriously, right? Beyond just class, but in terms of thinking about how a group, whether it's students, in motorcycle taxi riders, which is why I have this picture of motorcycles, or market traders or landowners, have some collective power in terms of how they represent their interests that you can't understand without taking social groups and social structures seriously. So again, that comes out of a critical realist approach that talks about this idea of emergence, which is simply the powers that collective entities have that emerge when they become collective, that are more than the sum of their parts, that you can't reduce to just the collective nor the individual, but emerge as being part of a group. And I think we can't avoid understanding how different groups in a particular society or city exercise power and have power without understanding the group nature of that. So I can say more about that. But so on the one hand, there's this question of how power is distributed among groups, but there's also the project, right? The nature of the government's project and what it's attempting to do in a city and why. And a lot of that seems to come down to efforts to legitimate oneself, particularly in the context of countries where the opposition is very powerful within the city. The potential for upheaval, social upheaval, protest of different kinds is strong within the city. And often there's not a lot of natural legitimacy, particularly in these countries, which are not very democratic in practice. They've tried to create a minimum amount of legitimacy for themselves to govern, to be able to govern in the city and to be able to hold power. But they've done this in very different ways. So on the one hand, in the top left is a picture from Addis of the housing under construction. And this mass construction of public goods has been interpreted by others and seems very clearly to be about trying to build an urban constituency among the middle classes, to develop a property-owning middle class, and to deliver these kinds of large, visible public goods. And actually, that was politically quite successful, even though Ethiopia sort of collapsed into revolution. It did not emerge from the city, whereas in previous periods of history, urban dwellers did overthrow regimes. So that's part of a legitimation project in Ethiopia. Whereas if you look at somewhere like Kigali, it's the post-genocidal effort to create a clean, blank slate, low crime, high security, securitized, very appealing to investors kind of an image, which is an outward-facing project in many ways, right? To bring in investment, to bring in foreign aid, to keep those things coming, which is a very different kind of legitimation project from providing mass public goods. The picture on the left bottom is every month in Kigali, there's a public works day where everybody will engage in sweeping streets, doing cleaning and greening. And this kind of thing is very typical of how state-society relations work. And then on the right, you have Kampala, where the project of legitimation seems to be much more about what Alicia Holland has called forbearance, right? So this idea that you simply withhold the law and you withhold regulations strategically at different times, sometimes all the time for some groups, sometimes only part of the time, as a way to gain political support. So you actually actively work against state structures and authorities and rules, and thereby create a sort of legitimacy for yourself to govern. Now that obviously has a completely different effect on the urban fabric than these other approaches. So this is the second factor. So the third one, and this draws on a paper that I wrote a couple of years ago, is this idea that there are different kinds of political informality. And I wrote this paper because it was part of a workshop on urban informality, and we were thinking through the economic, spatial, and political aspects. And I was actually asked to think about this for a paper, and it was a challenge. But essentially, when thinking about these cities, there are different ways in which political norms, regularized practices of engaging in politics, relate to formal rules and plans and regulations and structures. Sometimes there's an effort to bring the two together, right? To try and create a formal system that is tightly policed informally. And that's what you see in Kigali. You see the use of all kinds of informal policing, surveillance, state-society negotiation to support a formal structure and give the impression of a very tight control. Whereas in other cases, you will see the use of populist gestures, informal politics, interventions, bargaining, to use the word used to me in Kampala, that will deliberately undermine the formalized framework. And these are different kinds of, and this creates a different culture, a different political culture, if you like. So this was the third factor. And then the final one, this is this is just a diagram from the earlier paper I wrote, which I won't talk about much now, but it was an attempt to sort of map loosely thinking about the relationship between politics and formal institutions, rules and laws, and the relationship between politics and predictability and order. This is not, I don't normally do this kind of thing. This is a very political sciencey thing, but I wanted to think about this in an attempt to unpack the different ways in which politics that happens outside of typical political spaces relates to formal frameworks for governance. Then the fourth element of this framework is around infrastructure itself. And this, there's been so much literature on infrastructure, on urban infrastructure, a huge anthropology of infrastructure, all of this interesting socio-material stuff coming out of assemblage approaches and others as well within geography and other disciplines, that talks about sometimes really the vitality, the agency that infrastructure has, right? The idea that infrastructure itself has agency, it, sometimes even conceived as being sentient and having really quite a fundamental role in how cities develop. So there's that, and I did want to engage with that literature because it makes a big difference when you insert particularly a big mega project into a city that has all kinds of knock-on effects that may not be anticipated. But then there's also the literature that goes back to sociologists like Michael Mann that talks about infrastructural power as a metaphor, right? As a metaphor for the ability to implement rules and regulations across territory. So for those of you who don't know that work, he uses the example from Alice in Wonderland, the book Alice in Wonderland, where there's the Red Queen. Despotic power is the ability to say, go and kill Alice. And I can say that and no one can stop me saying that. And there's no constraints on my despotic power. Infrastructural power is the ability for me to actually get somebody to go out, find Alice, track her down, kill her, bury her, whatever. So these are kind of different kinds of political power. The point being that to have that infrastructural power actually also requires infrastructure, right? And the countries that have high levels of infrastructure are quite able to roll these projects out without a lot of resistance, like Rwanda, right, which has the highest density of road network in Africa. That's also because they have had historically high levels of infrastructural power. Social networks, kind of capillaries in Foucault's terms of power that work through interpersonal interaction to enable things to be implemented. So, but that's not just to say that, if you see an infrastructure project, it's the result of some powerful person saying, I want this to happen, and then it happens. It often doesn't turn out as expected. So I talk about the idea that, we see infrastructures as a mediant of power. They mediate power, but not always faithfully, not always in the way designed. They do have some effect, even if we don't have to go so far as to say they have agency. So in a minute, I'm going to talk, so how do we think about all these things together? Because obviously I've introduced a whole range of different things from different literatures to try and understand a big question, which is a why question about why these different types of urbanization are emerging with distinct effects. And I also think about that in relation to the question of scale. So certainly there's capitalism, there's neoliberalism. You read a lot of literature and they will explain any city in the world based on, well, this is how capital works and it's doing this. And of course, you can see profit being made. You can see regulations being tweaked in the interests of capital. But that doesn't differentiate enough to understand these differences. And at the same time, I think there is something regional going on here about the particular pace and lateness of urbanization that it enabled this region to be seen as this final frontier where suddenly there's a rush to invest in real estate. There's a rush to invest in infrastructure because it has been underdeveloped and the population is growing so fast. So there's a regional story to this. But then if we look lower, the national at the urban level, that's where we have to start to think about these things like within a given society, which groups are historically the most powerful. That can depend on colonial experiences, on experiences of land reform, of whether the society has been industrialized and created a capitalist class, all of these things. And then if we look at the city level, we can see how the experiences of a political project and the social norms that emerge through politics in a city over time. I can speak more about this, but I just want to get towards the end. I don't have much more. And now I'm going to say a bit about what the empirical chapters of the book are actually about. There's 4 chapters. And one of them is about, this question of the urban vision and the agenda for the city. which again, in each case is a little bit different. And the decisions about infrastructure investment are very telling and reveal a lot about the politics. So in this chapter, I take like one kind of infrastructure mega project in each city as a way of understanding the politics behind those urban visions. So this is a picture of the Kigali Convention Center, which was the most expensive building real estate project in all of Africa at the time it was built. It took a long time. It was a huge amount of resource and push to get it open so that they could do conference tourism, right, and present Kigali as this center of conference tourism and broader tourism. And the way that emerged tells us a lot about how the legitimation project of the government was essentially outward facing. Its priority was not so much to get support of urban dwellers, the majority of whom are not interested in this convention center, right? But to bring in investors, to keep the sense of Kigali as a place on the move. And that's very different from the big priority projects you saw in Addis, particularly in terms of, for example, the light railway, which we use as an example to see that. And then in Kampala, I look at the expressway from the airport to the city, which again, in terms of how the complications around land acquisition and the route of the road and all these kinds of things tells us quite a lot about the politics, the associational power, who's powerful in the city, and the legitimation project behind it. And then there's a chapter where I look at housing and property development. So essentially, what gets built for whom and where, because there are huge differences in the types of housing being developed, whether it's accessible at all to lower or even middle income groups, how well occupied that housing is, what approach is taken to informal settlements. So I use the term urban property scapes as a shorthand for all of that and try to explain why we see these very different property scapes emerging. Again, linking it back to these questions of not only who the powerful groups are and what the kind of legitimacy project is, but also what the infrastructural reach of the state is within the city. How easy is it to acquire land for new housing? To what extent can the government actually realize agendas around the property scape? And then there's a chapter that looks at the marketplaces and traders, street traders. Because again, these have been quite central to efforts to rebrand and reorganize cities, and with huge implications, right? So not only in terms of traders' ability to make a living, but also in terms of city dwellers' ability to actually access, basic goods, which in Kigali, for example, became really hard because of this attempt to limit the number of markets and keep them in certain places. So that told us quite a lot about the infrastructural capacities of the state, that it was able to reorganize markets in that way, but also about the way the political norms were, the lack of apparent protest, and the fact that the traders themselves didn't have much historical power and weren't able to draw support from political actors in the way they were in both the other cities in different ways. And then the final empirical chapter looks at urban politics itself, particularly in terms of protests, events, riots, collective mobilizations. Because for those other chapters, I've mostly been using kind of politics analyzed in these different ways, different scales, to explain changes in the built environment of the city. But the politics of the city itself is also different, right? And it responds to the changes of the built environment. So we see different ways in which people organize to contest, to resist, to undermine, to even attack changes that are happening within the city. So in this chapter, I want to understand why we see, for example, this regularized pattern of protests and riots in somewhere like Kampala, which has almost become part of the political culture, part of the political language. People often mobilize a riot to get a particular kind of response, or threaten to, even if they don't do it. And that's completely different from somewhere like Kigali, where nobody would do that. Not only would it likely be ineffective, but people are so aware of that it doesn't become part of the political practice. So again, I explore these differences in relation to the analytical framework. So just to kind of, for the sake of explaining the book in its form, I realized, of course, that there was a lot of history to look at that needed to be taken into account. But I also, I hadn't I ended up looking at doing the history work afterwards, but putting those chapters earlier on. And I felt like I needed to explore questions about land and how land becomes urban territory, how it becomes territorialized in terms of power and authority, but also how it becomes property in terms of changing ownership and tenure rights. So I look at that in a historical chapter that goes from pre-colonial right through to the present. And then in the second chapter, I look at how the urban economy emerged, because it's also important to understand how these cities were sites of trade, sometimes sites of heavy investment in industry, sometimes not. That obviously affects which groups become powerful and some of the dynamics of social organization in the cities. So there are two historical chapters as well. So I'm going to wrap up in a moment, but this is just an attempt in my final chapter to summarize some of the kind of findings across the three cities. And it's, of course, very much a simplification, as these things always are. But the point being that, you know, in both Uganda and Ethiopia, you have a distribution of power that you could call diffuse, in the sense that you have multiple, very complex ethnic groups occupying the city and a country that has been pieced together through various forms of imperialism over time to build a very, very complex unit, very difficult to govern, with powerful groups, kingdoms, and so on, in a way that was never the case in Rwanda, because you had a much narrower ethnic arrangement and you had a tightly organized kingdom for a long time, which corresponds roughly to the present day state. So already you have something very different going on in terms of the distribution of that. And partly for reasons related to that, you also have differences in that kind of reach of the state in terms of the infrastructural power of the state, which has been especially strong in Rwanda because of the historical development of the kingdom. Ethiopia, strong in some parts, weaker in others. And then in Uganda, where you had basically a dual, you know, not only did you have a real kind of weak integration of surrounding kingdoms, you also had a capital city that was basically split in half into a kind of native controlled, a typical kind of colonial dual city, which made it very hard for the state to actually implement its projects in the other half of the city. That has a strong legacy to this day. So those dynamics are important, but also very important is to understand that in each country, and I've made points about this already, you have very different approaches to legitimize governance, which in some cases, in both Uganda and Ethiopia, there's an effort to try and win over the urban population, but it happens in very different ways. So in Ethiopia, it's happened through the provision of all these huge numbers of public goods, particularly transport infrastructure and housing. But at the same time, in Ethiopia, you have a huge international diaspora who was hostile to the regime, around 2 million of them abroad. And you needed to provide an opportunity for them to profit so that they didn't agitate too much. And that resulted in this huge explosion of construction. In Uganda, you have something different going on, where there are still lots of groups that the government is trying to please in the city. But this has happened in a much more piecemeal way, much more sporadic, partly because it doesn't have the policy levers and the infrastructural power to do it in the Ethiopian way. But also there isn't the same history of a government being overthrown by the urban population, which you have in Ethiopia. And then in Rwanda, that focus to legitimize is very much on the outputs of development, the external audiences for that, and the need to seem regulated, controlled, clean, tidy, non-corrupt after what was seen as such a, what was the awful chaos and upheaval of the genocide. So to conclude, essentially I argue that capital, understanding cities through a prism of operations of capital is important, but there's something particular about how this is working in a place and time of late urbanization, a place where we see an idea of this as the final frontier, and we see huge infrastructure investments opening up that region in a particular way to capital. So there's a regionally specific relationship to capital that's been going on there. But of course, that doesn't result in the same kinds of urbanization dynamics, because we see completely different arrangements of power in the three countries, which are deeply rooted in their histories, colonial and beyond. And at the same time, that power of the different groups in the society evolves dynamically with the infrastructural capacities of the state. Because of course, if you have very powerful landlords, it's much harder for you then to acquire land, for example, to implement a project. So these two things evolve together. And this affects what gets built, who it's for, and things like whether there's housing available for different groups. It has fundamental consequences, whether there's transport that works. And then if we look at this a bit more, we can also see that governments, regimes coming into this picture will try and legitimize themselves in different ways, because they have different, they face very different range of groups with different powers, and they have very different kind of capacities in terms of their infrastructural capacities, and of the political norms that exist in a place, and the degree to which, for example, protest is likely to be mobilized. So all of these things affect how city dwellers can use their land and pursue their livelihoods. But within this, we also need to understand that there are infrastructures and physical changes that themselves have some kind of a power, and they don't always reflect the designs and the visions of the powerful. They carve paths of their own, and the way in which that happens, so the way in which the use of the Addis light rail differs from the planned use, relates to that distribution of power in society. Okay, so these things interact, obviously, and they don't always deliver on what is expected or promised. And then finally, that we need to look at that relationship between those physical transformations in the city and the way that people register their dissent, the way that people protest or not, the way they refuse or not to go along with government plans. Yeah, I will leave it there, because I've spoken enough. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tom, for this presentation.